My son had an accident, and I stayed by his side alone for days in the hospital, while my family planned a trip to the Maldives. Then they sent me. Enough with the tears. There's money to discuss. They were talking about my son's $500K life insurance policy.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
The fluorescent lights in the ICU hummed their relentless tune, casting everything in that harsh, sterile glow that makes healthy people look sick and sick people look like ghosts. I'd been sitting in this same uncomfortable chair for 6 days now, watching the steady rise and fall of Brian's chest, counting each breath like a prayer. 29 years old. That's all he was. 29 years of scraped knees I'd bandaged, baseball games I'd cheered at, homework I'd helped with, dreams I'd listened to over countless dinners at our little kitchen table. And now he lay here, tubes and wires connecting him to machines that beeped and whirred, keeping him tethered to this world by the thinnest of threads. The accident had been so sudden. One moment he was driving home from his job at the engineering firm. The next moment, a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into the driver's side of his Honda Civic. The paramedics said it was a miracle he survived the initial impact. The doctors said it was too early to tell if he'd wake up. But I knew my Brian. I knew the strength in him. The same stubborn determination that had gotten him through college on scholarships, while I worked double shifts at the elementary school where I'd taught for 37 years. The same fierce will that had helped us both survive when his father walked out when Brian was only 8, leaving us with nothing but each other and a mountain of debt. I reached over and took his hand, careful not to disturb the IV line. His skin was warm, which the nurses said was a good sign. I'd been talking to him constantly, reading him articles from the engineering journals he loved, telling him about the students who'd stopped by the house to ask about him. The doctors said hearing was often the last sense to go and the first to return. The Hendersons from down the street brought another casserole, I whispered, my voice hoarse from exhaustion. Mrs. Henderson made that tuna noodle thing you always pretended to hate, but I caught you eating cold from the fridge at midnight. My phone had been surprisingly quiet these past few days. Usually, my family group chat would be buzzing with updates about everyone's lives. But since Brian's accident, there'd been an odd silence. My older brother Robert, who lived just 20 minutes away, had visited once on the first day, staying barely an hour before claiming he had business to attend to. My younger brother Stephen had sent a brief text saying he was thinking of us but hadn't shown up at all. Their wives, Helen and Donna, had been even more absent. Helen, who used to call me every Sunday to gossip about the neighbors, hadn't called once. Donna, who was always asking to borrow things, had gone completely silent. It was strange, but I told myself they were probably just giving me space to process everything. The night shift nurse, Maria, was the only one who seemed to understand what this vigil meant. She'd bring me extra blankets without being asked, and she'd found me a slightly more comfortable chair from the family waiting room. The day nurses rotated, but they all knew me by now, the woman who wouldn't leave her son's side. I'd been surviving on cafeteria sandwiches and vending machine coffee, catching fragments of sleep in this chair that seemed designed to prevent any real rest. My back ached constantly, and my neck had developed a permanent crick from the angle I had to hold my head to watch Brian's face. But I wouldn't leave. I couldn't leave. What if he woke up and I wasn't there? What if he needed me and I was at home, selfishly sleeping in my own bed? The thought was unbearable. I'd raised him by myself for 21 years. We were a team, Brian and me, against the world. I wasn't about to abandon him now when he needed me most. On the 4th day, I'd finally gone home just long enough to shower and grab some clean clothes. The house felt impossibly quiet without Brian's presence. His coffee mug was still in the sink from that last morning, and I'd stood there staring at it for a full 5 minutes, unable to bring myself to wash it. It felt too much like giving up hope. That's when I'd noticed how quiet my phone had been. Not a single call from my brothers asking about Brian's condition. Not one text from their wives offering to help or asking what I needed. It was as if my family had simply vanished when I needed them most. I'd tried calling Robert that evening. It went straight to voicemail. I tried Stephen next. Same thing. Finally, I sent a message to our family group chat. Brian is still unconscious. Doctors say it's too early to know anything definitive. I'm staying at the hospital. Please keep him in your prayers. The message showed as read by everyone within an hour. No one responded. By the 6th day, I was starting to feel the physical toll of my vigil. My clothes hung loose on my frame from barely eating, and I could see in the reflection of Brian's room window that I looked haggard, older than my 61 years. But every time I considered going home for a real night's sleep, I'd look at his face and remember how he used to have nightmares as a little boy, how he'd call out for me in his sleep. The morning of the 7th day started like all the others. I bought coffee from the machine down the hall, settled into my chair, and began my morning ritual of reading Brian the local newspaper. I was halfway through an article about the town council's debate over the new traffic light when my phone buzzed. It was a message in our family group chat, from Robert. "Carol, enough with the tears. There's money to discuss." I stared at the screen, certain I was misreading. I read it again, then a third time. My hands started shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. More messages appeared in quick succession. "Stephen, we know about Brian's life insurance policy. $500,000 is a lot to figure out. Helen, we need to be practical about this situation. Donna, the funeral home said they need to know about arrangements soon." My vision blurred, not from tears, but from a rushing sensation in my head, as if all the blood was draining away. Funeral arrangements? Brian was breathing right in front of me. His heart was beating. The monitors showed brain activity. I scrolled up through the chat history, looking for messages I might have missed. That's when I found them. Messages from 3 days ago that somehow I'd never received notifications for. Messages sent while I was sitting right here, holding my son's hand, talking to doctors about his care plan. Robert. Just got off the phone with Peterson's funeral home. They can do a service next week. Stephen. Good. We need to handle this quickly. Helen found out Brian's policy pays out double for accidental death. Helen. Carol's being dramatic as usual. We can't let sentiment cloud our judgment here. Donna. Maybe we should talk to her doctor. She seems to be having trouble accepting reality. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. They thought he was going to die. No, that wasn't right. They wanted him to die. They were planning his funeral while I sat here fighting for his life. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Robert. We're at the Maldives resort until next Thursday. Needed to get away from all this stress. When you're ready to discuss things rationally, let us know. The lawyers need to know about beneficiaries. I looked up at Brian, his chest still rising and falling in that steady rhythm I'd been counting for days. His face, though pale, still held that stubborn set to his jaw that I recognized from his childhood. He was fighting. He was still here, still my son, still alive. And my family was on vacation, planning how to spend his life insurance money. I sat there staring at my phone for what felt like hours, though the clock on the wall showed only 20 minutes had passed. The messages seemed to burn on the screen, each word cutting deeper than the last. My brothers were in the Maldives. The Maldives. While I hadn't left this hospital chair for more than an hour at a time in 7 days. The worst part wasn't just that they'd abandoned us. It was that they'd planned this abandonment. Those messages from 3 days ago proved they'd been discussing Brian's funeral, his insurance money, his death, while I was right here watching him breathe, hoping he'd squeeze my hand back, praying for any sign of improvement. I looked at Brian, his face peaceful despite the ventilator helping him breathe. The doctors had reduced his sedation yesterday, hoping to see more brain activity. Dr. Martinez, his neurologist, had been cautiously optimistic about some of the reflexes he'd been showing. But my family had apparently already written him off. My hands trembled as I scrolled through more of the chat history I'd somehow missed. There were photos of Robert and Stephen at what looked like an airport lounge, drinks in hand, big smiles on their faces. Helen and Donna posing by a resort pool, wearing expensive-looking swimsuits I'd never seen before. The timestamp on the first photo was from 2 days after Brian's accident. I felt sick. Not the exhausted, empty stomach sick I'd been living with, but a deep, nauseating realization that the people I'd called family for 61 years were celebrating while my son fought for his life. Another message popped up in the group chat. Robert, Carol, we need you to be realistic about this. The doctors must have told you what we already know. Sometimes the kindest thing is to let go. Let go. As if Brian were a balloon I was selfishly holding on to instead of my child, my only child, the light of my entire world. I stood up so abruptly that my chair squeaked against the floor, drawing a concerned look from the nurse at the station outside Brian's room. I walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where I'd been parking my old Honda Accord every day for a week. The same Honda Brian had helped me pick out 3 years ago when my ancient Corolla finally died. "You need something reliable, Mom," he'd said, test driving car after car with me, even though he had his own engineering projects to worry about. "Something that'll keep you safe." That was Brian, always looking out for me, even as an adult. I pulled up Robert's number and called him directly. It rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. His cheerful voice came through the speaker. "You've reached Robert Davis. I'm currently traveling, but I'll get back to you as soon as possible. If this is an emergency, please contact." I hung up and tried Stephen. Same thing. Voicemail after 3 rings. That's when I noticed something else in our group chat. The little indicators showed that both Robert and Stephen were online right now. They weren't unable to answer. They were choosing not to. My phone buzzed with a new message, this time from Helen. "Carol, I know this is hard, but we're thinking about you too. You've been at that hospital for days. This isn't healthy. You need to start accepting that sometimes these things happen for a reason." For a reason. My son's accident happened for a reason, and apparently that reason was to make my brothers and their wives wealthy. I sank back into my chair, my legs suddenly too weak to support me. Brian's monitors continued their steady beeping, the sounds I'd grown so accustomed to that they'd become almost comforting. But now they felt different. Now they felt like proof of life that my family was choosing to ignore. Dr. Martinez appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand, that kind expression on his face that I'd come to associate with cautious hope rather than devastating news. "Mrs. Davis, how are you holding up?" I looked up at him, this man who'd been more present in Brian's care than my own brothers. "Doctor, when you spoke to my family about Brian's condition, what exactly did you tell them?" His eyebrows drew together in confusion. "I'm sorry, but I haven't spoken to your family. Patient confidentiality means I can only discuss Brian's condition with you, unless you've given written permission for me to speak with others. But they seem to know." I stopped myself. They didn't know anything about Brian's real condition. They'd made assumptions and then acted on those assumptions without ever bothering to call me, to ask me, to check on either of us. "Mrs. Davis, is everything all right? You look upset." I showed him the messages. I don't know why I did it. Maybe because he'd been kinder to me than my own family. Maybe because I needed someone to tell me I wasn't crazy, that what I was seeing was as wrong as it felt. Dr. Martinez read through the messages, his expression growing more serious with each line. When he finished, he handed my phone back and sat down in the small guest chair that had remained empty throughout Brian's entire stay. "Mrs. Davis, I need you to know that Brian's condition, while serious, is not hopeless. We've been seeing encouraging signs of brain activity. The fact that he's breathing over the ventilator, that his pupils are reactive, that he's showing some purposeful movement when we test for pain response. These are all positive indicators." I nodded, trying to focus on his words, instead of the messages that were still burning in my memory. "I was actually coming to talk to you about reducing his ventilator support over the next day or 2. We think he might be ready to breathe more independently. It's a good sign, Mrs. Davis. A very good sign." The irony was bitter. Brian was getting better, and my family was on vacation spending his life insurance money in their minds. "Doctor, hypothetically, if someone wanted to make medical decisions for Brian, how would that work?" His expression became very careful. "You are his next of kin and his medical power of attorney, correct?" "Yes." "Then all medical decisions go through you, unless you were to become incapacitated yourself or unless someone were to petition the court to have that authority transferred. But that's a complex legal process that requires substantial proof of incompetence or inability to make sound decisions." Something cold settled in my stomach. What kind of proof? Usually evidence of mental illness, dementia, substance abuse, something that would genuinely impair someone's ability to understand medical information and make rational choices. It's not something that happens easily or quickly. I nodded, filing this information away. My phone buzzed again. Stephen. Carol, Helen talked to a lawyer friend of hers. She says if you're not thinking clearly because of grief, we might need to step in to help with Brian's care decisions. We just want what's best for everyone. Dr. Martinez saw me reading and his jaw tightened. Mrs. Davis, you've been making perfectly rational decisions about Brian's care. You've been here every day, asking intelligent questions, following all our recommendations. There is absolutely nothing about your behavior that suggests anything other than a devoted mother advocating appropriately for her son. But I was beginning to understand that rational behavior and devoted motherhood weren't what my family was interested in. They wanted the money, and I was standing in their way by refusing to give up on Brian's life. My phone rang. Finally, a call instead of just messages. But it wasn't Robert or Stephen. It was a number I didn't recognize with a local area code. Hello? Mrs. Davis, this is Thomas Peterson from Peterson's funeral home. I believe your brother Robert spoke with you about arrangements for your son. I felt the world tilt sideways. Excuse me? We have an appointment scheduled for tomorrow to discuss services. I wanted to confirm the time that works best for you. The funeral home. They'd actually called a funeral home and made appointments, while Brian was breathing right in front of me. There's been a mistake, I managed to say, my voice coming out strange and hollow. My son is still alive. There was a pause on the other end. Oh my. I'm so sorry. Your brother seemed quite certain. He said arrangements needed to be made quickly. I'll cancel that appointment right away. After I hung up, Dr. Martinez was watching me with concern that had shifted into something that looked like anger on my behalf. Mrs. Davis, I think you need to consider that your family may not have your son's best interests at heart. That's when I realized the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about money. This wasn't just about a family vacation taken at the worst possible time. This was about people who saw Brian and me as obstacles to their financial gain. People who were willing to plan our tragedies before they'd even happened. And for the first time since the accident, I felt something other than fear and exhaustion. I felt anger, clean and sharp and surprisingly energizing. They wanted to discuss money? Fine. We were going to discuss a lot more than that. 3 days after the funeral home called, something extraordinary happened. I was reading Brian the sports section. He'd always loved following the local baseball team. When his fingers moved, not the reflexive twitches the doctors had mentioned, but actual purposeful movement. His hand turned in mine, and for the first time in 10 days, he squeezed back. I dropped the newspaper and leaned forward. Brian? Baby, can you hear me? His eyelids fluttered. Then, slowly, they opened. Unfocused at first, then gradually finding my face. His mouth moved around the ventilator tube, trying to speak. Don't try to talk yet, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. Just squeeze my hand if you can understand me. He squeezed, firmly, deliberately. I pressed the call button so hard I probably bruised my thumb. Within seconds, Dr. Martinez and 2 nurses rushed into the room. What followed was a whirlwind of tests, adjustments, and carefully controlled excitement as they confirmed what I already knew in my heart. My son was coming back to me. This is remarkable progress, Dr. Martinez said as they began the process of removing the ventilator. Much faster than we hoped for. Brian, can you follow my finger with your eyes? Brian's gaze tracked the doctor's movement perfectly. When they finally removed the breathing tube, his first word was barely a whisper. Mom? I sobbed openly then, not caring who saw me. I'm here, baby. I'm right here. I never left. I know, he whispered, his voice rough but clear. I could hear you reading to me. The engineering journals were putting me to sleep. Even weak and disoriented, he was making jokes. That was my Brian. Over the next few hours, as Brian's condition stabilized and he became more alert, I found myself hesitating to share the news with my family. Part of me wanted to savor this miracle privately, to have this moment of pure joy before it became complicated by their presence and their expectations. But mainly, I was afraid of their reaction. Afraid of what their disappointment might look like when they realized their Maldives vacation had been funded by counting money that was never going to come. Finally, as evening approached and Brian had been moved from the ICU to a regular room, I sent a simple message to the family group chat. Brian woke up today. He's going to be okay. My phone stayed silent for over an hour. When responses finally came, they weren't what I expected. Robert, that's great news, Carol. Really great. Stephen, wonderful. We'll cut our trip short and come home. Helen, praise God. We've been praying for a miracle. Donna, can't wait to see him. Give him our love. The messages felt wrong somehow. Too measured, too careful. Like they'd been crafted by committee rather than written by people who'd just learned that their nephew had made an incredible recovery. Brian noticed my expression as I read, "Everything okay, Mom?" I looked at my son, propped up in his hospital bed, color returning to his cheeks, his eyes bright and alert. How could I explain that his recovery was apparently inconvenient for some people? "Just letting the family know you're awake," I said instead. "They'll be so relieved." But even as I said it, I wondered if that was true. The next morning brought another surprise. Dr. Martinez arrived with a woman I didn't recognize, someone in a business suit carrying a briefcase. "Mrs. Davis, this is Sandra Walsh from the hospital's patient advocate office. She asked to speak with you about some concerns that have been brought to our attention." Sandra Walsh had kind eyes but a serious expression. "Mrs. Davis, we received some calls yesterday from people claiming to be Brian's family members. They expressed concerns about your mental state and your ability to make sound medical decisions on his behalf." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What kind of concerns?" "The callers suggested that you were refusing to accept the reality of Brian's condition, that you were perhaps suffering from some kind of psychological break due to grief. They requested information about having medical power of attorney transferred to them." Dr. Martinez's expression was grim. "I told Ms. Walsh that these concerns are completely unfounded. You've been exemplary in your care advocacy for Brian, and his recovery has proven that your instincts about his condition were absolutely correct. The timing is interesting," Sandra added carefully. "These calls came in yesterday afternoon, several hours before your family would have received the news about Brian's improvement." I stared at her, the implications sinking in. "They called yesterday afternoon, before I told them he was awake? The first call came in at 2:30 p.m. According to your message history, you didn't contact your family until after 6 p.m. My hands started shaking again. They hadn't been responding to Brian's recovery. They'd been preemptively trying to have me declared incompetent before they even knew he was getting better. "What exactly did they say?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Sandra consulted her notes. "The caller identified himself as Robert Davis, your brother. He claimed you'd been delusional about Brian's prognosis, that you were refusing to accept reality, and that the family was concerned about your erratic behavior and poor judgment. He suggested that someone more objective should be making medical decisions." "He called before he knew Brian was awake," I repeated, just to make sure I understood. "He was trying to take away my authority to make decisions about my son's care while he was on vacation in the Maldives." Dr. Martinez's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Davis, I want to be very clear about something. At no point during Brian's care have you exhibited anything other than appropriate concern and rational decision-making. If anything, your constant presence and advocacy likely contributed to his positive outcome. Many patients don't have someone willing to be such a consistent advocate." Sandra nodded in agreement. "We see this sometimes, unfortunately. Family members who aren't present for the day-to-day reality of a patient's care can develop unrealistic expectations or make assumptions based on limited information. What's unusual here is the timing and the agenda that seems to be behind these concerns." I thought about the messages, the funeral home appointment, the vacation photos while Brian lay unconscious. They thought he was going to die. They wanted him to die. The words hung in the air, ugly and true. Sandra and Dr. Martinez exchanged a look that told me they'd reached the same conclusion. "Mrs. Davis, Sandra said gently. I need to ask you directly. Do you feel safe? Do you feel that your family has your and Brian's best interests at heart? Before I could answer, my phone rang. Robert's name appeared on the screen. I showed it to Sandra and Dr. Martinez, who both nodded encouragingly. Put it on speaker, Dr. Martinez suggested. Given the circumstances, I think it's important that we all hear this conversation. I answered the call and hit the speaker button. Carol, thank God you finally answered. We've been so worried about you. The concern in his voice sounded genuine, but I'd learned to listen more carefully to my family's words. Worried about me? Honey, the hospital called us yesterday. They're concerned about your mental state. They said you've been making some questionable decisions about Brian's care. I looked at Sandra, who was shaking her head firmly and making notes. What kind of questionable decisions, Robert? Well, apparently you've been refusing to accept the doctor's recommendations. They said you're not being realistic about Brian's condition. Dr. Martinez leaned closer to the phone. Mr. Davis, this is Dr. Martinez, Brian's neurologist. I'm wondering who at the hospital gave you that information, because it's completely inaccurate. There was a long pause on the other end. Who is this? I'm Brian's doctor, and I can assure you that Mrs. Davis has been following all medical recommendations perfectly. In fact, Brian woke up yesterday and is making remarkable progress. Another pause. Longer this time. When Robert spoke again, his voice had changed. The fake concern was gone, replaced by something flatter and more calculating. That's wonderful news about Brian. Really, but we're still concerned about Carol. She's been under tremendous stress. Maybe it would be better if we came back early to help with decisions. Sandra leaned forward. Mr. Davis, this is Sandra Walsh from Patient Advocacy. I need to inform you that the hospital has no concerns whatsoever about Mrs. Davis's mental state or decision-making capacity. Your calls yesterday contained inaccurate information about both Brian's condition and his mother's competence. Silence on the other end. Then the sound of muffled voices, as if Robert was covering the phone to talk to someone else. When he came back on, his tone had shifted again, becoming more aggressive. Look, I don't know what Carol has told you people, but this family has been through a lot. We're just trying to help. If Brian is really recovering, then that's great. But Carol isn't the only one who cares about him. Of course not, Dr. Martinez said smoothly. When will you be returning from your vacation to see him? The question hung in the air. I could practically hear Robert scrambling for an answer that wouldn't sound as callous as the truth. We'll figure out our travel arrangements and get back as soon as we can. After he hung up, the three of us sat in silence for a moment. Finally, Sandra spoke. Mrs. Davis, I think you need to be prepared for the possibility that your family's next steps may involve legal challenges to your guardianship of Brian. Based on this conversation and the timing of their previous calls, it seems clear they have motivations that may not align with Brian's best interests. I nodded, feeling strangely calm. The worst had happened. I'd learned who my family really was. But Brian was alive, getting stronger every hour, and I had allies now who could see the truth of our situation. What do I need to do to protect him? I asked. Sandra smiled for the first time since I'd met her. You keep doing exactly what you've been doing, and we'll make sure to document everything very carefully. 2 days after the conference call with Robert, I was helping Brian with his physical therapy exercises when Sandra Walsh appeared in the doorway with a thick manila folder and an expression that made my stomach clench. Mrs. Davis, do you have a few minutes? I need to show you something. Brian was doing remarkably well. The doctors were amazed at his progress. No significant brain damage, no paralysis, just some weakness on his left side that was improving daily with therapy. But as I looked at Sandra's serious face, I felt that familiar dread settling in my chest. Brian, I'll be right back, I said, squeezing his hand. Mom, whatever it is, I can handle hearing it, he said, his voice stronger than it had been yesterday. I'm not a child anymore. Sandra looked between us, then nodded. Actually, Brian should probably hear this too. It concerns him directly. She sat down and opened the folder, revealing what looked like legal documents, printouts of emails, and official-looking letterhead. Yesterday afternoon, we received a formal petition filed with the county court. Your brother Robert and your brother Stephen are requesting emergency guardianship over Brian, claiming that you are mentally incompetent and making decisions that are endangering his welfare. I felt the room spin slightly. But Brian is getting better. Everyone can see he's getting better. That's exactly what makes this so unusual, Sandra continued. The petition was filed with a date stamp showing it was submitted 3 days ago, the same day Brian woke up, but several hours before that happened. Before anyone knew he was recovering, Brian's face darkened. They filed legal papers to take control of my care while I was unconscious? Sandra nodded grimly. It gets worse. We've also received copies of medical consultations that Robert arranged without your knowledge or consent. He contacted 3 different doctors, claiming to be seeking second opinions about Brian's care. She pulled out more documents. Dr. Peterson at Valley Medical, Dr. Stevens at Regional Hospital, and Dr. Morrison at City General. All 3 were contacted by Robert, who identified himself as Brian's concerned uncle and co-guardian. Co-guardian? I interrupted. He's not Brian's guardian at all. That's correct. But according to these consultation reports, Robert told each doctor that you were in denial about the severity of the situation, and that the family was concerned about your refusal to consider end-of-life options. My blood went cold. End-of-life options? Sandra's expression was grim as she read from one of the reports. Dr. Peterson's notes indicate that Robert specifically asked about compassionate withdrawal of life support and whether it was possible to override a mother's emotional attachment when medical facts clearly indicate no hope of recovery. Brian's jaw dropped. He was shopping for a doctor who would tell him to pull the plug. It appears so. And here's the most disturbing part. These consultations took place over several days while you were here providing round-the-clock care. Robert was simultaneously questioning your competence and seeking medical opinions that would support ending Brian's life. I felt sick. Not the exhausted nausea I'd been living with, but a deep, revolting realization of how calculated this all was. Did any of the doctors support what he was asking? Actually, no. All 3 doctors noted in their reports that they couldn't provide meaningful opinions without examining the patient directly and consulting with his primary care team. Dr. Morrison specifically noted that family members calling for second opinions without involving the patient's mother raises significant ethical concerns. Sandra pulled out another set of papers. But here's what's truly damning. We have email records. She handed me printouts of email exchanges. The sender was Robert's email address, and the recipients were Stephen and both their wives. The subject line read, Brian situation, timeline and strategy. I read the first email with growing horror. Stephen, talk to the 3 doctors. None will commit to supporting withdrawal of life support without examining Brian themselves, but Dr. Peterson seemed most sympathetic to our concerns about Carol's unrealistic expectations. I think if we can get legal guardianship transferred, we can arrange for him to do an independent evaluation. Need to move fast on the incompetence petition. If Brian improves at all, this gets much harder. Helen's lawyer friend says we need documented evidence of Carol making clearly irrational decisions, but we can probably use her refusal to discuss funeral arrangements as evidence of denial of reality. A key points for court filing. Carol refusing to accept medical reality. Carol isolating Brian from family input. Carol making emotional rather than rational decisions. Family concerned about her mental stability. Timeline goal. Get guardianship transferred before any significant improvement. Once we have legal authority, we can make appropriate medical decisions. I read it twice, then handed it to Brian without a word. His face went white, then flushed red with anger. They were planning to kill me, he said quietly. While you were here taking care of me, they were planning to kill me for insurance money. Sandra nodded. The next email in the chain is even more explicit about the financial motivations. She handed me another printout. This one was from Stephen to Robert. Talk to the insurance company. Policy pays full amount for accidental death, and there's no waiting period since it's been in effect for over 2 years. The key is that if this drags on too long and becomes a chronic care situation, rather than death from accident injuries, they might try to argue reduced benefits. Helen looked up medical guardianship procedures. If we can prove Carol is making decisions based on emotion rather than medical facts, court will transfer authority. Then we can authorize appropriate comfort care measures. Also confirmed, as Brian's uncles, we're next in line after Carol for both guardianship and insurance beneficiary status if she's found incompetent or if there are questions about her fitness to handle the estate. I stared at the email, reading it over and over. They weren't just planning Brian's death. They were planning to take my place as his guardian and his beneficiary. They were trying to erase both of us from his life. There's more, Sandra said gently. Show them the financial records, please. She pulled out bank statements and credit card records. We obtained these through the court filing process. Your brothers and their wives spent $47,000 on their Maldives vacation. Resort suites, spa treatments, private excursions, first-class flights. Brian looked at the numbers. $47,000. In 1 week? The interesting part is the timing of when this vacation was booked and paid for. The resort reservation was made the day after your accident, Brian. The flights were purchased that same evening. The timeline was becoming clear, and it was worse than I'd imagined. Within hours of learning about Brian's accident, they'd decided he was going to die, calculated how much money they'd receive, and planned a luxury vacation to celebrate. Mrs. Davis, Sandra continued, there's one more thing you need to see. We found this in Robert's email sent to the hotel concierge. She handed me a final printout. It was a note to the resort staff. We're celebrating a family settlement that's been very stressful to resolve. Please make sure our suite has champagne service and your best ocean view. This is a very special trip for us. A new beginning after a difficult family situation has finally been resolved. Money is no object for this celebration. The words blurred as I read them. A celebration. They'd gone to the Maldives to celebrate my son's death before he was even dead. Brian was gripping the bed rails so tightly his knuckles had gone white. How long have you known about all this? We started investigating when the timing of Robert's calls seemed suspicious, Sandra explained. But the full scope only became clear when we received the guardianship petition and were able to request disclosure of related communications as part of the legal discovery process. I looked at my son, alive and alert, and getting stronger every day, and felt something shift inside me. Not just anger now, but a cold, clear determination. They'd tried to steal his life and my role as his mother for money. They'd planned his funeral while he was still breathing. They'd tried to have me declared mentally incompetent so they could authorize ending his life support. What happens now? I asked Sandra. Now we fight back. We have evidence of fraud, attempted medical manipulation, and what could potentially be considered conspiracy to commit. Well, let's just say we have very strong evidence of criminal intent. Brian struggled to sit up straighter in his bed. I want to be involved in this. Whatever legal action we're taking, I want to be part of it. Sandra smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her. Actually, Brian, as the intended victim of this scheme, your testimony will be crucial. And the fact that you've made such a remarkable recovery completely undermines their entire argument about your mother's judgment. I felt something I hadn't experienced in 2 weeks. Hope. Not just hope for Brian's continued recovery, but hope that there might actually be consequences for what my family had tried to do to us. One more thing, Sandra added, pulling out a final document. The court has scheduled a hearing on their guardianship petition for next Monday. They'll have to appear and explain their actions under oath. I thought about Robert and Stephen, probably still lounging by the pool in the Maldives, thinking they were so clever, so entitled to money they'd never earned from the potential death of a nephew they'd never really cared about. They wanted to discuss money? Fine. Let's see how much their greed had cost them. The courthouse hearing was scheduled for Monday at 10 a.m., but Robert and Stephen didn't show up. Their lawyer, a nervous-looking man named Mitchell Barnes, appeared alone and requested a postponement, claiming his clients were dealing with a family emergency overseas. Judge Patricia Hawthorne, a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and sharp eyes, was not impressed. Mr. Barnes, Your clients filed an emergency petition claiming that Brian Davis was in immediate medical danger due to his mother's incompetence. Are you telling this court that their family emergency in the Maldives takes precedence over the emergency they themselves declared? The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, my clients were not aware that Mr. Davis had shown improvement. They've been operating under the assumption that his condition was deteriorating. Mr. Barnes, Judge Hawthorne said, looking at the documents Sandra had provided. According to these medical records, your clients filed this petition on the same day that Mr. Davis regained consciousness. They also spent $47,000 on a luxury vacation while claiming to be concerned about a family medical emergency. This court finds their priorities questionable. Sandra stood up from our table. Your Honor, we request that the court dismiss this petition with prejudice and consider sanctions against the petitioners for filing fraudulent emergency claims, granted on both counts. Mr. Barnes, your clients have 48 hours to appear before this court to explain their actions, or I will issue contempt citations. This hearing is adjourned. Brian was in a wheelchair beside me, insisting on attending despite still being weak. As we left the courthouse, he squeezed my hand. Mom, I think we need to be prepared for them to come back fighting. They've lost their legal case, but they're not going to just give up the money they thought they had coming. He was right. That evening, my phone started ringing. Robert first, then Stephen, then Helen, then Donna. I let them all go to voicemail. When I finally listened to the messages later, they painted a picture of people who still believed they were the victims in this situation. Robert's voice was tight with anger. Carol, I don't know what lies you've been telling people, but we're family. We were just trying to help. You can't shut us out like this. Stephen sounded more plaintive. Mom would be so disappointed in how you're tearing this family apart. We made some mistakes, but we can work this out. Helen's message was calculated manipulation. Carol, honey, I know you're upset, but Brian is going to need ongoing care. You can't handle this alone. Let us help. Donna was direct. This is ridiculous, Carol. We're going to fight this. Brian is our nephew, too. The next morning, they appeared at the hospital. All four of them, tanned from their Maldives vacation, dressed in expensive clothes, carrying flowers and balloons like this was a normal family visit. I was in Brian's room when the nurse called to say I had visitors. Brian and I looked at each other, and he nodded. Let them come up, he said. I want to see their faces when they try to explain themselves. Robert entered first, his arms spread wide in a gesture of false warmth. Brian, thank God you're okay. We came as soon as we could. Brian's expression was cold. As soon as you could? You've been back from vacation for 3 days. Helen rushed forward with the flowers. We brought you some cheerful things for your room. We've been so worried. Worried enough to file legal papers trying to have me killed? Brian's voice was steady, but I could see the anger in his eyes. The room went very quiet. Stephen cleared his throat. Brian, I think there's been some misunderstanding about what we were trying to do. I read your emails, Uncle Stephen. You were planning to withdraw my life support for insurance money while celebrating with champagne in the Maldives. Donna stepped forward, her face flushed. That's not fair, Brian. You're taking things out of context. We were just trying to prepare for all possibilities. By booking a luxury vacation the day after my accident? Robert's face had gone red. Now listen here, young man. We've been nothing but supportive of this family. Your mother has obviously been filling your head with twisted interpretations of, get out. Brian's voice cut through Robert's bluster like a knife. What? Get out of my room. Get out of this hospital. Don't come back. Helen tried a different approach, her voice becoming syrupy and manipulative. Brian, honey, you're still recovering. You're not thinking clearly. Family is forever. We all make mistakes when we're stressed. Brian reached for the nurse call button. Mom, would you please ask security to escort my visitors out? They're not welcome here. Stephen looked genuinely confused, as if he couldn't understand why anyone would be upset with their behavior. Brian, we're your uncles. We love you. This whole situation has been blown out of proportion. You tried to have me declared brain dead so you could collect my life insurance money, Brian said, his voice getting stronger with anger. You hired lawyers to take away Mom's right to make medical decisions about my care. You celebrated my accident with a $47,000 vacation. What exactly have I blown out of proportion? Robert's mask finally slipped completely. You ungrateful little... That's enough. My voice came out harder than I'd heard it in years. You heard him. Leave. Now. But Robert was beyond caring about appearances now. This is about money, isn't it, Carol? You think you're going to keep it all for yourself? Well, let me tell you something. What money, Robert? I interrupted. Brian is alive. There is no insurance money. There never was going to be insurance money unless you'd succeeded in killing him. We weren't trying to kill anyone. Helen's voice rose to nearly a shriek. We were being realistic about a tragic situation. Brian's laugh was bitter. Realistic? You called funeral homes before I even woke up. You shopped for doctors who would authorize pulling my plug. You filed legal papers to take away Mom's authority to keep me alive. What part of that was realistic instead of homicidal? Stephen made one last attempt at reason. Brian, families go through difficult times. People say and do things they don't mean when they're under stress. We can move past this. Uncle Stephen, Brian said, his voice quiet now but carrying absolute finality. You spent $47,000 celebrating what you thought was going to be my death. You tried to steal my mother's right to fight for my life. You wanted me dead for money, and when I didn't die, you tried to kill me legally. He paused, looking each of them in the eye. There is no moving past that. There is no family relationship after that. You are strangers to me now, and you always will be. The security guards arrived then, 2 large men in uniforms who had clearly been briefed on the situation. Folks, you need to leave the premises now, one of them said politely but firmly. As they were escorted out, I heard Robert's voice echoing down the hallway. This isn't over, Carol. Family doesn't just disappear because of misunderstandings. But he was wrong. Family had disappeared, not because of misunderstandings, but because of the truth. The truth about who they really were when money was involved. The truth about how little Brian and I actually meant to them compared to $500,000 they'd never earned. After they left, Brian and I sat in silence for a long time. Finally, he spoke. Mom, I need to tell you something. While I was in the coma, I could hear some of what was going on around me. Not everything, but voices, conversations. I heard you reading to me, talking to me, telling me to fight. I took his hand, my throat tight with emotion. But I also heard other voices sometimes. Uncle Robert was here that first day while you were down getting coffee. He wasn't talking to me. He was on his phone with someone, and I heard him say something about how this might work out better than we thought. And Carol's always been too emotional to handle something like this. My blood went cold. He was planning this from the very beginning. I think so. And Mom? I heard him tell whoever he was talking to that if I didn't make it, you'd probably fall apart completely, and they'd need to step in to handle the practical matters. The full scope of their plan became clear. They hadn't just been hoping Brian would die. They'd been counting on me falling apart so completely that they could take over everything. His care, his estate, probably my life too. They underestimated us, I said quietly. Brian smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him since the accident. They definitely did. But you know what, Mom? I'm glad this happened. I stared at him. Glad? Not the accident. But glad we found out who they really are before it was too late. Glad we learned that we don't need them. Glad we discovered that we're stronger than they ever gave us credit for. He was right. For the first time in 2 weeks, I felt something other than fear, anger, or exhaustion. I felt proud. Proud of my son's strength. Proud of my own refusal to give up. Proud that we'd stood up to people who'd tried to destroy us for money. So, what happens now? I asked. Now we build the life they tried to steal from us, Brian said. And we do it, without looking back. Outside the hospital window, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Tomorrow, Brian would probably be discharged. Tomorrow, we would go home together. Tomorrow, we would start over. Just the 2 of us. the way it had always been. But tonight, for the first time since the accident, I felt something I'd almost forgotten: peace. 2 years later, I stood in the kitchen of our new house, making coffee on a Tuesday morning that felt like a small miracle. Through the window, I could see Brian in the backyard, throwing a tennis ball for the golden retriever puppy we'd adopted 6 months ago. His left side was still a little weak, but you'd have to know what to look for to notice it. The house was smaller than the one I'd lived in for 30 years, but it was ours in a way that old house never could be again. After everything that happened, I couldn't bear to stay in the place where I'd received those cruel messages, where I'd sat alone wondering why my family had abandoned us. So we'd sold it and moved across town, to a quiet neighborhood where nobody knew our story, and we could simply be Carol and Brian, mother and son, starting fresh. Brian had made a full recovery, returning to his engineering job 8 months after the accident. His colleagues had been incredibly supportive, and his supervisor had even arranged for him to work from home during his initial recovery period. The brain injury that my brothers had been so eager to declare fatal had healed completely, leaving no lasting effects except perhaps a greater appreciation for life and a clearer understanding of what truly mattered. We'd never heard from Robert, Stephen, Helen, or Donna again. Not directly anyway. The contempt citations Judge Hawthorne had issued resulted in substantial fines, and there had been some legal consequences for their attempted fraud that I'd chosen not to follow too closely. I'd learned from Sandra Walsh that they'd hired expensive lawyers to defend themselves, draining much of whatever savings they'd hoped to supplement with Brian's insurance money. The irony wasn't lost on me that their greed had ended up costing them far more than they could have ever gained. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that Robert and Helen had been forced to sell their house to pay legal fees. Stephen and Donna had apparently filed for bankruptcy. Part of me wondered if I should feel sorry for them, but whenever that impulse arose, I remembered the sound of Robert's voice on that phone call, discussing appropriate comfort care measures while Brian lay fighting for his life. Some bridges, once burned, were meant to stay that way. Brian came through the back door with Max, the golden retriever, both of them slightly out of breath from their morning play session. "Mom, don't forget I have that appointment at 3 today," he said, refilling Max's water bowl. "The therapist?" "Yeah, doctor. Chen says I'm making great progress with the emotional processing stuff, but she wants to work more on the family trauma aspects." Brian had started seeing a therapist about 6 months after the accident, not because of his physical recovery, that had gone remarkably well, but because of the psychological impact of learning that people he'd trusted his entire life had been willing to end his life for money. The betrayal had been harder to heal than any physical injury. "How are you feeling about that?" I asked, settling at the kitchen table with my coffee. He sat down across from me, his expression thoughtful. "Better, actually. Dr. Chen helped me realize that what they did says nothing about my worth as a person and everything about their character. I used to lie awake thinking about what I'd done wrong, why I wasn't worth more to them than money." I reached across and squeezed his hand. "You were worth everything to me. You still are. I know that now. And you know what's weird? I'm actually grateful for what happened." This was something he'd said before, but it still surprised me each time. "Grateful?" "Think about it, Mom. We could have gone our whole lives not knowing what they were really like. We could have continued having family dinners and holiday gatherings, never realizing that they saw us as potential sources of income rather than people they loved. The accident forced them to show their true colors." He was right, though it had taken me longer to reach that perspective. I'd spent months angry, not just at them but at myself for being so blind to their nature. How had I missed the signs? How had I failed to see that their interest in Brian's life insurance, their questions about my retirement savings, their suggestions that I was too trusting with money, had all been ways of evaluating our worth to them? "Besides," Brian continued, grinning, "if it hadn't happened, I never would have met Sarah." Sarah was Brian's girlfriend, a nurse he'd met during his extended recovery period. She'd been working in the rehabilitation unit and had apparently been impressed by his determination and positive attitude, despite everything he'd been through. They'd been dating for 8 months now, and I'd never seen Brian happier. Speaking of Sarah, I said, didn't you want to ask me something about Saturday? His face lit up. Actually, yes. I was wondering if you'd be okay with me inviting her family for dinner. Her parents are visiting from Oregon, and she'd love for them to meet you. I smiled. Of course, I'd love to meet them. This was what family was supposed to look like. People who cared about each other, who wanted to share good news and create connections, who saw each other as blessings rather than burdens or potential windfalls. My phone rang, and I glanced at the caller ID. It was Sandra Walsh. We'd stayed in touch over the past 2 years, partly because there had been ongoing legal matters to resolve, but mostly because she'd become a friend. She'd seen us through the worst period of our lives and had continued to check on us as we rebuilt. Sandra, how are you? Doing well, Carol. I'm actually calling with some news that you might find interesting. Remember how I told you that the hospital administration was reviewing policies about how family complaints are handled? Yes, you mentioned they were making changes. Well, the changes have been implemented, and they're being used as a model for other hospitals in the region. Patient advocates now have direct authority to investigate suspicious family challenges to medical decision-making. And there are new protocols for identifying potential cases of financial motivation behind guardianship requests. I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. So other families won't go through what we did? It'll be much harder for them to. Your case has been written up in medical ethics journals, with all identifying information removed, of course, as an example of how financial interests can corrupt family dynamics during medical crises. It's actually being used in training programs for medical social workers. After I hung up, Brian looked at me curiously. Good news? Sandra says our experience is helping protect other families from what we went through. He nodded approvingly. Good. Something positive should come from all that ugliness. That afternoon, while Brian was at his therapy appointment, I found myself looking through old photo albums. There were pictures of family gatherings from before the accident, images of Brian as a child playing with his cousins, holiday celebrations where everyone looked happy and connected. The photos looked the same as they always had, but I saw them differently now. I could see Robert's calculating expression when he looked at Brian's graduation watch. I could remember Helen's comments about how well-insured Brian was through his job. I could recall Stephen's suggestions that I should invest more aggressively with my retirement funds and his offers to help manage my money. The signs had been there all along. I'd just chosen not to see them because I'd wanted to believe we were loved for who we were, not for what we might be worth. But that willful blindness had protected us in a way, too. It had allowed me to focus on building a genuine relationship with Brian, to raise him with values of kindness and loyalty, to create a bond that was strong enough to survive their attempt to destroy us. When Brian came home from therapy, he found me putting the photo albums away. Throwing out the past? He asked. Just making room for the future, I replied. That evening, Sarah came over for dinner. She was a lovely young woman, about Brian's age, with kind eyes and a gentle laugh. But what I loved most about her was the way she looked at Brian. Not with pity for what he'd been through, but with admiration for who he'd become. Mrs. Davis, she said as we cleared the dinner dishes, I hope this isn't too personal, but Brian told me about what happened with your family. I just wanted to say how much I admire the strength both of you showed. We didn't have much choice, I replied. When people you love try to hurt you, you either fight back or let them succeed. But you did have a choice about how to handle it afterward. A lot of people would have become bitter or closed off, or would have lost their ability to trust anyone. Instead, you've both remained open to new relationships, new possibilities. That takes incredible courage. Later, after Sarah had gone home and Brian was settling in for the night, he came to the kitchen where I was finishing the dishes. Mom, I need to tell you something. The serious tone in his voice made me turn around, concerned. I'm going to ask Sarah to marry me. Relief and joy flooded through me in equal measure. Oh, Brian, that's wonderful. I wanted to make sure it was okay with you first. I know we've been through a lot together, and I don't want you to feel like I'm abandoning you or replacing our family with a new one. I dried my hands on the dish towel and turned to face him fully. Honey, you're not replacing our family. You're expanding it. That's what families are supposed to do. Grow and change and welcome new people in. He hugged me then, and for a moment he was my little boy again, seeking reassurance that he was making the right choice. Besides, I added, Sarah's parents seem lovely, and I'm looking forward to having more people to cook for during the holidays. That night, as I got ready for bed in my small but comfortable bedroom, I reflected on how much our lives had changed. 2 years ago, I'd been sitting in a hospital chair, exhausted and alone, discovering that the people I'd called family were planning to benefit from my son's death. Tonight, I was planning a wedding and looking forward to meeting new in-laws who would hopefully become the kind of family Brian and I deserved. The phone rang just as I was about to turn off the light. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something about it seemed familiar. Hello? Carol, it's Helen. I sat down heavily on the edge of my bed. In 2 years, this was the first direct contact from any of them. What do you want, Helen? Her voice sounded older, more fragile than I remembered. I wanted to apologize. For everything. We were wrong, and we know that now. Do you? The legal fees, the bankruptcy, losing our house, it's all been very difficult. But more than that, we've lost our family. Robert hasn't spoken to Stephen in months because they blame each other for how everything went wrong. The grandchildren barely know us anymore because their parents don't trust us with them. I waited, not sure what she expected me to say. I know we can't undo what we did, but I wanted you to know that we realize we made terrible mistakes. We let money become more important than family, and we've paid for it. Helen, I said finally, I'm not going to pretend that I'm not glad there were consequences for what you tried to do to Brian and me. But I'm not calling those consequences justice or revenge. They're just the natural result of the choices you made. I know that. Her voice cracked. I just wanted to ask, is there any chance we could we ever be family again? The question hung in the air between us. 2 years ago, it would have broken my heart. The old Carol, the one who always tried to keep peace, who always forgave family no matter what they'd done, might have been tempted to say yes. But that Carol had died in a hospital room the day she learned that her family had celebrated her son's accident with champagne and vacation photos. Helen, you tried to have my son killed for money. You celebrated what you thought was going to be his death. You tried to have me declared incompetent so you could make medical decisions that would have ended his life. We weren't thinking clearly. We were scared and stressed, and you were calculating and cold and focused entirely on money that wasn't yours from a life that wasn't yours to take. Silence on the other end. But more than that, Helen, even if I could forgive what you did to Brian and me, I can't forget it. And I can't trust you with the people I love now. Brian is getting married. I'm going to have a daughter-in-law and hopefully grandchildren someday. I will never ever put them at risk by bringing people into their lives who see other human beings as potential sources of income. Carol, please. Goodbye, Helen. Don't call here again. I hung up the phone and turned off the light. Outside my window, I could see the stars beginning to appear in the clear night sky. Tomorrow, Brian and I would start planning his wedding. Next week, I would meet Sarah's parents. Next month, we would celebrate the anniversary of Brian's recovery, a date that had become more important to us than any birthday. We had built something beautiful from the wreckage of what others had tried to destroy. We had learned that family wasn't about blood or obligation, but about love and loyalty, and choosing to protect each other when the world became dangerous. And we had learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the courage to walk away from people who don't deserve them. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about the future we were building. Brian and Sarah, their children someday, the holidays and celebrations and ordinary Tuesday mornings that make up a life well lived. A life where people were valued for who they were, not what they were worth. A life that no amount of money could ever buy, and that no amount of greed could ever steal. That was the price of blood, I realized. Not the money my brothers had hoped to collect, but the understanding that some bonds are worth more than gold, and some are worth nothing at all. The trick was learning to tell the difference.